Hello, family members. Hope you're having a nice day today. I want to talk today about the connection between ICE and police and military. Um, I've been thinking a lot about what's the same and what's different between ICE actions now and, say, police violence over the last 20 years, right? Um, But I also recently watched the new Dan Olson video, which talks a lot about military culture. And the contrast in that and the similarities in that really got me thinking. And I think this is something that we kind of need to start reckoning with, which is there is a distinct difference between the sort of acute crisis we're seeing with the federal government sending in essentially occupied military force, which is ICE, which is presented as if it's a border patrol, but is clearly acting and feels entitled to act well without, you know, well within and without that mandate. And, um, like sort of run of the mill. I hate to say that, but it's true. Police violence. And, there's a lot of people who want to compare the current moment to moments in the past or make comparisons, the whole oppression Olympics things that always seems to become part of the conversation gets thrown out there, then people start throwing out all sorts of terminology and it becomes discourse and it doesn't become very productive, right? I mean, yesterday I put out a meandering video basically where I touch on that in a much more disorganized way, but that's the thing is that there there's a lot of subtle conversation that we need to have, but we also can't let those more nuanced conversations distract us from the bigger picture here too. And I think the bigger picture is that this didn't happen, overnight, right? We didn't get to where we are now out of nowhere. This was a gradual building and an escalation of events, even within just what ICE has been doing since Trump deployed them as an occupying force. And we didn't get away with deploying the National Guard as an occupying force within the United States. He kept getting legal pushback. He kept getting pushback within, military leadership and such. But ICE, that wasn't going to happen because the figurehead that is ruling ICE is fully under his thrall, is willing to do whatever it is that he sets forth. I mean, that's explicitly been said. It's not like that's the me making an assumption. That's explicitly been their argument for their positions in DHS and in ICE leadership is that they will do whatever it is that Donald Trump tells them without question. And for some reason thought that was, like an argument for them being the appropriate person for that job, which that goes to show you that the moment is very strange that we're in, right? Anyway, we have this, very militarized, federalized force going into communities they are explicitly not part of, whether it's the National Guard or ICE, and explicitly there to serve the interests of the president and not the local community, and very eager and willing to ignore any any sort of feedback given by the state government, the county government, the city government, the local communities. They look at them and as antagonists, as people that they are against, as instead of people that they are ostensibly at least there to serve. And I think because the all law enforcement has become so increasingly militarized since 9/11, not just in the type of equipment that they are able to get, which is increasingly more and more military weaponry, for fighting against other nations, other hostile nations being used and deployed in American streets, but also just the culture. Now, before we kind of fully delve into that, I want to acknowledge that police culture has been a problem in the United States for a long time. I mean, the idea of the good old boy network, everybody is aware of that, where you have law enforcement interests serving themselves and maybe a few, rich local businessmen and politicians who are willing to, do some dirty dealing with them. That kind of corruption, that's old, you know, that the elites would rope in police and try to convince them that they are part of the elite as well in order to be able to control the police and suppress the what they consider underclass, but just, regular people. Well, that's not new. But I think that people often overlook how benign that that police culture can appear and yet be so dangerous at the same time. I grew up with a dad that hunts, and he is and always has been Libby, lefty leaning kind guy, card carrying Democrat kind of guy, and a little bit of a hippie, like environmentalist type. Didn't really fit into your normal hunting set, but hunting is not usually an activity that men engage with solely as individuals. And that certainly was never his experience. His dad was, from old school West Virginia family and was politically quite different from his son. But he taught him, that that's what men did. They got their guns, they went and they ran around in the woods uh, and had good times together, like, so for him, hunting is certainly a social activity as well as something that he would do on his own, even without that. And so, in order to have guy friends who were hunters, bird hunters to be clear, not big game hunters, not, you know, you may or may not understand the, the difference there, but if you do, you do. Um, so, like in order to have friends, he would occasionally have law enforcement friends, which is always something well, as far back as I can remember, I remember feeling uncomfortable about it. But then again, I was exposed to things like he had this friend who was a U.S. Marshal, and he had bought a dog from my dad. My dad bred Brittany's bird dogs, and through proxies or whatever, he bought this dog from my dad. And then, they kind of like met up and they're like, oh yeah, I kind of like each other, like vibing. Well, um, this federal officer, let's just call him John. John was kind of guy who was kind of gregarious and charming and everything, and you kind of liked him. But then he'd start telling you stories about like anytime that John would travel anywhere, he was always, always, always speeding. Like, not just like miles over the speed limit, like, normal people, but like he'd be going 85, 90 miles an hour in like a 70-mile-an-hour zone. And he'd get stopped. And all he'd have to do is flash his U.S. Marshal badge, and that was that. And he was gone. I mean, it was maybe like a matter of seconds, the interaction. maybe. You know, like it wasn't even a question to him that he would be able to flout the law, not in any sort of a official capacity. This is like fully him on his time off, just driving from his house to our house. He lived in the South, unsurprisingly, and we lived in the north edge of the South, which is West Virginia. And so he'd come up to see my dad, and he would drive like that the entire way, multiple jurisdictions. My dad was with him and witnessed this firsthand. And I guess just seeing that, like, recklessly flouting of the law and this, just complete and total entitlement to do that, seeing someone be like that just so openly and unabashedly, I understood from a pretty early age that police saw themselves as separate from non police and above non police. They're always going to be willing to just help each other out just by default. They're going to assume that another law enforcement agent is somebody who is part of their in group, and they will treat them differently always. And I just knew that. Like, that was never something I ever questioned. And I always had a mistrust of the police for that reason. And I always thought it was extremely toxic the way that they would talk about being in, like the blue family, the police family, whatever, whatever. And it wasn't just like people who were part of law enforcement. You would see people who, oh, her dad is just, one of the local deputies. She can do whatever she wants. Oh, that guy's brother is, the state trooper for this area. You don't want to mess with him because then you're going to have that trooper on your butt all the time, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't think that most Americans were unaware by the time that they became adults that people had connections to law enforcement, and law enforcement were just treated differently by law enforcement than everyone else. I think a lot of people didn't see it as big of a problem as I did, but I think most people saw that it was a problem. And I think when you mix that in with military culture after 9/11, it became extremely dangerous. You have people who are increasingly being impressed with the culture of the military, which is that of an invading foreign force that sees all other humans they encounter as antagonists by default because they're from the other country. You know, that's military culture. Mixing that in with this already insular police culture, not just meaning that they see non police as slightly less than the police family. Like, it's not just that they're preferentially treating other law enforcement and people who have connection to law enforcement. It is that they're actively antagonistic against anyone who isn't actively in law enforcement with them right now. I mean, I think we've seen ICE be antagonistic to other law enforcement agents, right? So, just being law enforcement isn't enough for ICE, but that they've taken that military culture, the worst of it, and they've mixed it with the worst of that police culture, and then they know they have more or less judicial immunity. Again and again and again and again, we have seen that police officers get away with just not being prosecuted. And when it comes to ICE officers, do you think that there's any chance that a federal government that sent them there to do what they're doing is going to say, oh no, you were supposed to follow all local laws and rules, and you were supposed to follow these previously established rules of engagement? No. You know, it, right now we have, in Renee Good's murder, we have the federal government going out of its way to destroy evidence, corrupt the case, and actively impede the ability of any state government or local government to step in and do anything. Like, they are making it clear we're not going to prosecute him, and we're not going to let anyone else do it either. You know, when Jonathan Ross shot Renee Good 3 times as she was trying to flee him, as she was past him, and he could not have believed by that third shot that it was him acting in self-defense. He had to have known that. I mean, he testified just recently that he's a weapons instructor. Like, he knows the rules of engagement. He had to have followed them for the most part in order to have been in ICE for the decade plus that he's been in it. Okay? He knows. He just flouted that. And he flouted that because he knows that those old rules of engagement aren't being enforced anymore. A law that is not being enforced is basically non existent. If there's not some sort of enforcement mechanism for a law and it's not consistently enforced, then it is not a just law. You understand that, right? I mean, that's why I always get very angry about like speed limits or seatbelt laws. I'm like, I understand that. I think you should always wear your seatbelt. Every time I get in a car, I put a seatbelt on. Even when my belly is like gonna explode, it feels so bad. I will still, be uncomfortable and put on the seatbelt because they know that nobody thinks they're going to get in an accident until it happens to them, okay? Like, you're at equal risk every time you get behind the wheel of a car or even are just a passenger of a car. But I don't think that we should have seatbelt laws because they're so selectively applied. They can be used by law enforcement to force a point of contact with somebody who they otherwise do not have the legal right to have a point of contact with. And I think that every time that there is a point of contact with police in today's current environment, it is a chance for somebody to be injured. And generally, by somebody, I mean either an innocent bystander or the person that the police look at as being suspect. Not even necessarily a criminal, just suspect. I mean, I was rewatching Big Joel's video about the Minneapolis police essentially being found to be a criminal organization after George Floyd, and in the time frame when we actually had a DOJ that at least attempted to follow the law and made some sort of show of trying to investigate crimes. They kept even after training was changed, even after George Floyd was murdered on camera, and it was clear that there was going to be legal repercussions for his murderer. In a rare exception to reality, there were still people who were using force in excess, specifically neck restraints, in the same city after there's no way they didn't know. They just didn't think they didn't think they'd face any consequences for what they did, and they probably didn't. Here's the thing about laws. Nobody thinks they're going to be caught. When they commit a crime, when they break a law or a norm, they never think they're going to be held to account. They might think that other people might take the same action as them and be held to account, but it's not them. They're going to be smarter. I mean, it's the same reason why people use Q-tips in their ears, even though they know that it can lead to wax impaction or eardrum perforation or whatever. They never think it's going to be them that happens to. They always think that they can do it in a safe way, even if that's not what, history has shown. So you can't just put a law in place and expect it to change people's behavior without that enforcement mechanism. But it's really, really hard work to consistently enforce something. And so what'll happen a lot of times is people will just start letting things slide. And they let 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 things slide until you end up with a woman being shot 3 times by someone who had approached her vehicle, stepped out of the way of her vehicle as she was driving away, and felt fully entitled to take physical action against her and then insult her and say that she was an effing bitch. I mean, it wasn't enough that he'd killed her. He still hated her. Even as she was dying behind the wheel of her car, even as her wife's screaming, even after everyone else around him is like reacting like normal human beings, his reaction is fucking bitch. And not even like angry, just like annoyed. Like, how annoying that you would even dare to challenge me even a little bit. I can't imagine all of the horrible levels of dehumanization you have to go through where you get to a point where you feel like somebody has mildly inconvenienced you or challenged you in a way that you didn't like, and you need to or have the right to shoot them and murder them and in their own neighborhood, and you're still just annoyed by them. But one thing we know about, well, there's a few things we know about Jonathan Ross. You hear a lot of rumors, and I am not trying to engage with that. But according to him and his own court testimony from just a few months ago, he started out in the military. He went to Iraq. He got that military mindset where you're looking around and you're seeing the people who just live in the neighborhood that you're in as antagonizing to you, as an opponent to you, as someone who has the capacity to harm you, to risk your life. And so you have the, justification to potentially harm them proactively because they could at some point want to harm you. And then he joined Border Patrol. And boy, I'm sure that didn't help at all with his mental state and seeing people as us and them and as dehumanized. And then he's been with ICE for 10 years? And he's been going around and trying to find people who were not worthy of being in the United States and ruin their lives. I'm sure that his connection with humanity has been whittled away at for a very long time. he bears full responsibility for what he has done. But we have to reckon with the fact that we spent years creating men like him as a society and giving them less and less guardrails and less accountability. And we would be like, oh, you have to follow the law. But then when they wouldn't follow the law, we would look the other way. We've been sending, as a society, mixed signals to our law enforcement for a long time. I said yesterday on my Facebook that we need to be voting for proposals, not people. And so this is my proposal. It is time for all local politicians to start establishing their answer to the police force. You know, we say we want to abolish the police, and that idea just goes over like a thud from the people who feel like the police are all that's there that's saving them, or they don't know what they would do if somebody was making them feel physically unsafe, or if they had someone stealing from them or stalking them or whatever. And we need to give the people the answers to those questions first before we can expect them to buy into the idea that these law enforcement agencies have been corrupted beyond fixing. That the culture that we have allowed to stagnate for decades can't be fixed. It cannot be just incrementally fixed and made better. We forget one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. It's not one bad apple, oh well, what do we do? It's one bad apple spoils the whole rest of the group. There are too many bad apples in law enforcement. And so we need to stop exposing people who do want to serve their community to that barrel of rotten apples. We need to give them new barrels to join, if you get my meaning. I think that's something I'll be expanding upon later. But, you know, here I am. I don't want to just point out a problem without at least a discussion starting place for what we could do about it in a practical sense. All right, BB, say goodbye to the peoples. Oh, she's gonna be the baby. All right, we'll talk to you later. Love you, bye.